Deputy Mara Voss had been back in BlackWell for exactly 4 months when the almanac first mentioned the coming blood moon, a small line of print in the local paper that most residents skimmed past without a second thought. Mara noticed it only because her grandmother used to circle those dates in red ink on the kitchen calendar, a habit Mara had once dismissed as harmless superstition from a woman who distrusted anything she could not explain. She had left BlackWell at 18, certain she would never return to the small farming town tucked between cornfields and dense woodland, but a messy divorce and a need to care for her aging father had brought her back 3 years sooner than she ever intended. She had taken the deputy position out of necessity rather than passion, patrolling roads she had memorized as a teenager, nodding to faces that had not changed nearly as much as her own life had. The town itself remained exactly as she remembered it, a modest main street lined with brick storefronts, surrounded on every side by the same endless fields of corn that had defined BlackWell's economy for over a century. She thought little of the almanac entry beyond a brief, nostalgic pang for her grandmother, who had passed away during Mara's years away, and returned her attention to the mundane business of small-town law enforcement. She had no way of knowing, as she folded the newspaper and set it aside that morning, that the date circled in her grandmother's old calendar habit marked something far more dangerous than any superstition she had grown up dismissing. BlackWell's history stretched back over 150 years, founded by a small group of settlers who had cleared the surrounding forest to establish farmland in a region that, according to local legend, the native tribes before them had specifically avoided for reasons no written record ever fully explained. Mara had grown up hearing fragments of this history from her grandmother, stories delivered in hushed, serious tones during long summer evenings on the porch, tales of a bad harvest in the town's earliest years that had nearly starved the original settlers, and of the desperate measures they had allegedly taken to ensure the land would provide for them going forward. Her grandmother had always been vague about the specifics, mentioning only that the town's founders had made some kind of arrangement with the land itself, an arrangement that required periodic renewal through means her grandmother refused to describe in detail even when Mara pressed her as a curious teenager. Mara had long assumed these stories were simply colorful local folklore, the kind of tale every small town seemed to cultivate about its own origins, embellished over generations until fact and fiction became impossible to separate. She thought of these stories again now, driving her patrol route past the Hargrove family's cornfield, where a large, weathered scarecrow stood sentinel among the stalks, its burlap face faded nearly featureless by decades of sun and rain. The scarecrow had stood in that same field for as long as Mara could remember, older even than her grandmother's stories suggested, and she had never once thought to question why a single farming family maintained such elaborate care over what should have been an unremarkable, replaceable piece of agricultural equipment. The Hargrove family had farmed the same land at the edge of BlackWell for 5 generations, and Mara had gone to school with the current generation's youngest son, a quiet, watchful boy named Ellis Hargrove who had grown into an equally quiet, watchful man now running the family farm alongside his aging father. Mara stopped by the Hargrove property later that week to follow up on a minor complaint about fence damage along the property line, and found herself studying the scarecrow more closely than she had in years, noting the strange, careful stitching along its burlap face and the unusual, dark stains marking the fabric of its worn overalls, stains that resembled old blood far too closely for Mara's comfort once she allowed herself to consider the possibility seriously. Ellis noticed her attention and mentioned, in his characteristically clipped, reserved manner, that the scarecrow had been in the family for generations, maintained and repaired rather than replaced, a tradition his father insisted upon despite Ellis's own private skepticism regarding its practical necessity. Mara asked him, half joking, whether the family scarecrow had some kind of special significance beyond simple frugality. Ellis's expression grew notably more guarded at the question, and he replied only that his father took such matters seriously and that Mara would do well to ask her own grandmother's old friends if she wanted the full story, since his family preferred not to discuss it openly with outsiders. Mara filed the strange, deflective answer away in her memory, sensing that she had touched upon something the town's older residents considered a topic best left undisturbed, though she could not yet have guessed how urgently that buried topic was about to force its way back into violent, undeniable relevance. That evening, Mara visited her grandmother's oldest friend, a sharp-eyed woman named Edith Calloway who had lived in BlackWell her entire life and who still maintained a small house near the edge of town filled with the kind of clutter that accumulates over 8 decades of careful, deliberate living. Edith welcomed Mara warmly, offering tea and the kind of gentle, probing questions about her life that only old family friends seemed to ask without causing offense. Mara eventually steered the conversation toward the Hargrove scarecrow and her grandmother's old stories about the town's founding arrangement with the land, and watched as Edith's warm, welcoming expression shifted into something far more guarded and serious. Edith admitted, after a long, considering pause, that the stories Mara's grandmother had shared carried more truth than most younger residents cared to believe, explaining that the town's original settlers had indeed made some kind of desperate bargain during that first terrible harvest, though the precise nature of the arrangement had been passed down only through careful, selective oral tradition among a small number of founding families, the Hargroves prominent among them. She explained that the bargain required periodic acknowledgement, tied somehow to the rare astronomical alignment of a blood moon, and that the Hargrove family's careful maintenance of their ancestral scarecrow represented an essential part of fulfilling whatever obligation the town's founders had originally established. Mara asked directly what would happen if that obligation went unfulfilled. Edith's expression grew genuinely frightened for the first time since Mara had arrived, and she admitted quietly that she did not know for certain, since no one living in BlackWell today had ever witnessed a failure of the old arrangement, but that the stories passed down through her own family suggested consequences far worse than anyone in town currently wished to imagine. Mara left Edith's house that evening with far more unease than she had anticipated when she first decided to pursue her idle curiosity about the Hargrove scarecrow. She drove home along the familiar dark roads bordering the cornfields, glancing occasionally toward the shadowed rows of stalks illuminated only by her headlights, and found herself thinking, with a discomfort she could not entirely rationalize away, about how easily something could hide unseen within those dense, towering fields that surrounded the town on nearly every side. She mentioned the conversation with Edith to her father that night, hoping he might offer some more grounded, skeptical perspective to counter the growing unease Edith's serious warnings had planted in her mind. Her father, a lifelong BlackWell resident himself, listened with an expression Mara found difficult to read, and eventually admitted that he too had heard fragments of similar stories throughout his own childhood, though he had always assumed they amounted to nothing more than colorful local folklore designed to explain away the town's occasional hardships and misfortunes through a comforting, if superstitious, narrative framework. He did mention, almost as an afterthought, that he recalled his own father once telling him that the town had experienced a series of unexplained, violent deaths roughly 60 years earlier, deaths that had never been satisfactorily resolved by any official investigation, occurring during a year he vaguely recalled being associated with some kind of unusual celestial event. Mara felt a chill settle over her at this new information, and though she told herself firmly that coincidence and faded memory likely explained her father's vague recollection, she found herself checking the newspaper's almanac page again that night, confirming with growing dread exactly how many days remained before the blood moon's arrival. Over the following days, Mara used her access to the sheriff department's records to research the unexplained deaths her father had vaguely recalled, eventually locating faded case files documenting a series of brutal, unsolved killings that had occurred in BlackWell during a single autumn many decades earlier. The old reports described the victims in clinical, understated language that nonetheless conveyed a horrifying level of violence, bodies discovered in and around the town's cornfields bearing wounds the original investigating officers had struggled to attribute to any conventional weapon or animal attack. The case files offered no resolution, no suspect ever identified or charged, the investigation apparently abandoned entirely once the killings stopped as abruptly and inexplicably as they had begun. Mara cross-referenced the dates against historical astronomical records and confirmed, with a growing sense of dread that settled deep into her stomach, that the killings had indeed coincided precisely with a documented blood moon event that autumn, matching almost exactly the same celestial alignment now approaching within days according to the newspaper's almanac page. She brought her findings to Sheriff Daniel Pruitt, her direct supervisor and a man who had held his position in BlackWell for over 2 decades, hoping he might offer some official insight or record that could either confirm or dispel her growing suspicions. Pruitt's reaction surprised her considerably, his usually easygoing demeanor shifting into something far more serious and guarded as he studied the old case files she had gathered, and after a long, uncomfortable silence, he admitted quietly that certain matters regarding BlackWell's history were handled through channels that did not always align with standard law enforcement procedure. A cryptic admission that only deepened Mara's growing unease about exactly what kind of danger might be approaching the town alongside the coming blood moon. Sheriff Pruitt eventually explained, with obvious reluctance, that a small group of town elders, drawn primarily from BlackWell's original founding families, maintained certain traditional responsibilities related to the community's welfare that operated largely outside conventional civic or law enforcement structures. He admitted that he himself possessed only limited knowledge of these traditions, having been briefed in vague, general terms upon assuming his position as sheriff decades earlier, sufficient to understand that certain unusual occurrences should be reported directly to this elder council rather than pursued through standard investigative channels. Mara pressed him for more specific information regarding what exactly these traditions entailed and why they took such obvious precedence over ordinary law enforcement protocol, but Pruitt admitted he simply did not know the full details himself, having always assumed the arrangement amounted to little more than a ceremonial holdover from the town's early religious or agricultural customs. He agreed, however, given the mounting evidence Mara had presented connecting the old killings directly to the blood moon's astronomical timing, that the matter warranted immediate, serious attention rather than continued dismissal as mere folklore or coincidence. He suggested they approach the elder council directly, specifically requesting a meeting with the Hargrove family patriarch Ellis's father Thomas Hargrove, who Pruitt believed held particular significance within whatever traditional arrangement the town's founders had originally established. Mara agreed readily, though she found herself feeling a growing, urgent anxiety as she calculated exactly how many days remained before the blood moon's arrival, understanding instinctively that whatever answers they eventually managed to obtain from the reluctant, secretive Hargrove family might prove to be running dangerously short on time before that mysterious astronomical event finally arrived over BlackWell's quiet, unsuspecting fields. Thomas Hargrove agreed to meet with Mara and Sheriff Pruitt only reluctantly, and only after Pruitt made clear that continued silence regarding the town's traditions was no longer an acceptable response given the serious historical evidence Mara had uncovered connecting past violence directly to the approaching celestial event. They met at the Hargrove farmhouse on a gray, overcast afternoon, and Thomas, an elderly man whose weathered features carried the same guarded watchfulness Mara had noticed in his son Ellis, finally began explaining, with evident reluctance, the true nature of the arrangement his family had maintained for generations. He confirmed that the town's original settlers had indeed made some kind of desperate bargain during their first terrible harvest, though he insisted he did not fully understand its true origin or mechanism, only that his own ancestors had established a ritual involving the careful maintenance and periodic renewal of a specific ancient scarecrow, believed somehow to contain or channel whatever dangerous force the original bargain had invoked. He explained that the renewal ritual required specific actions timed precisely to the rare blood moon alignment, actions his family had performed faithfully for generations without incident, until, he admitted with obvious distress, a mistake had occurred during the most recent blood moon event decades earlier, a mistake he believed directly responsible for the unexplained killings documented in Mara's old case files. Mara asked urgently what kind of mistake had occurred, and whether the same error might risk repeating itself during the rapidly approaching blood moon now only days away. Thomas's expression grew genuinely fearful as he admitted that the ritual's exact details had been imperfectly recorded and passed down through his family, and that he could not guarantee with any certainty that the coming renewal would proceed successfully this time either. Mara pressed Thomas Hargrove for every remaining detail he could provide regarding the ritual's specific requirements, hoping desperately that sufficient preparation might prevent whatever catastrophic mistake had apparently occurred during the previous blood moon decades earlier. Thomas explained, consulting an old, water-damaged journal kept locked within a family safe, that the ritual required fresh materials gathered from the current year's harvest, specific herbs grown only within a small, carefully tended garden behind the Hargrove farmhouse, and a precisely timed ceremony conducted at the exact moment the blood moon reached its fullest point in the night sky. He admitted that his own grandfather, who had overseen the previous failed renewal, had left behind only fragmentary notes regarding what specifically had gone wrong that terrible autumn, notes suggesting some kind of interruption or incomplete completion of the ceremony's final steps, though the precise nature of that interruption remained frustratingly unclear even after Thomas's own careful study of the surviving family records. Sheriff Pruitt asked whether additional community resources or personnel might be mobilized to ensure the ritual's successful completion this time, given the serious, documented risk of failure. Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of expanding knowledge of his family's secretive traditions beyond their historically narrow circle, but eventually agreed, given the gravity of the situation, that additional careful preparation and vigilance throughout the town might indeed prove wise regardless of his family's traditional preference for handling the matter privately. Mara left the Hargrove farmhouse that afternoon with a mixture of cautious relief that they finally possessed some concrete understanding of the danger approaching BlackWell, and profound, lingering dread regarding how thin and uncertain that understanding actually remained given everything still left unexplained within the family's incomplete, generations-old records. In the days that followed, Thomas Hargrove worked diligently alongside his son Ellis to prepare for the ritual's proper execution, gathering the required harvest materials and herbs while carefully reviewing every surviving fragment of family documentation for any additional guidance that might prevent a repeat of whatever catastrophic error had occurred decades earlier. Mara continued her own parallel investigation, researching historical newspaper archives and county records for any additional information about the previous blood moon killings that might shed further light on the ritual's exact failure point. She discovered, through careful cross-referencing of old obituaries and property records, that the previous ritual failure had apparently occurred the same year the Hargrove family patriarch of that generation, Thomas's own grandfather, had suffered a serious injury only days before the blood moon's arrival, an injury that Mara suspected might have compromised his ability to complete the ceremony's demanding physical requirements as thoroughly or precisely as the tradition demanded. She shared this theory with Thomas, who considered it carefully before admitting that his grandfather's old journal did indeed mention a fall from a hay loft occurring shortly before that fateful autumn, an injury he had apparently attempted to push through despite its severity rather than delaying or modifying the ritual's timing to accommodate his weakened condition. This discovery offered Mara a small measure of cautious reassurance, suggesting that the coming ritual might succeed without incident provided Thomas himself remained in good health and properly prepared throughout the demanding ceremony ahead, though she remained acutely aware that countless other unknown variables might still threaten the successful completion of a tradition whose precise mechanisms remained only partially understood even by the very family responsible for its faithful. Generational maintenance. 3 days before the blood moon's scheduled arrival, Mara found herself increasingly anxious despite the Hargrove family's careful, methodical preparations, unable to shake a persistent, nagging sense that something crucial remained overlooked within their current understanding of the ritual's exact requirements. She returned once more to Edith Calloway's house, hoping the elderly woman's deep well of local historical knowledge might yield some additional insight the Hargrove family's own fragmentary records had failed to preserve. Edith listened carefully as Mara described everything she had learned from Thomas Hargrove, and eventually mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she recalled her own mother once describing the ritual as requiring not just the Hargrove family's direct participation, but also a form of communal acknowledgement from the broader town itself, some gesture of collective awareness or participation that the isolated, private nature of the Hargrove family's modern approach to the tradition might have inadvertently abandoned over the intervening generations. Mara felt a fresh chill of unease at this revelation, recognizing that if Edith's memory proved accurate, the Hargrove family's increasingly private, secretive handling of the ritual over recent decades might itself represent a significant deviation from the original, more communally rooted tradition established by the town's earliest settlers. She relayed this new information immediately to Thomas Hargrove, who received it with visible distress, admitting that his own family's records made no explicit mention of any broader communal requirement, though he acknowledged that such details might simply have been lost or deliberately obscured over generations of increasingly private, insular family stewardship of a tradition originally intended for the entire town's shared benefit and collective responsibility. Faced with this troubling new uncertainty, Sheriff Pruitt and Thomas Hargrove agreed, after considerable discussion, that some form of broader community awareness and participation should be arranged before the blood moon's arrival, even if the exact requirements remained frustratingly unclear given the incomplete state of the family's surviving historical records. They decided to organize a modest town gathering times to coincide with the ritual's approach, framing it publicly as a harvest celebration to avoid alarming residents with the full, disturbing truth regarding the tradition's actual purpose and historical stakes. Mara helped coordinate the practical logistics of this gathering, working alongside town officials to arrange a bonfire and communal meal near the town square, while privately hoping that this modest, improvised gesture toward broader community participation might satisfy whatever additional requirement Edith's fragmentary memory had suggested the original tradition once demanded. As preparations continued, Mara found herself growing increasingly restless and anxious with each passing day, unable to fully shake the nagging suspicion that their current understanding of the situation, despite weeks of dedicated research and preparation, remained fundamentally incomplete in ways that might yet prove catastrophically significant once the blood moon finally arrived. She spent her evenings continuing to research the town's oldest historical records, searching desperately for any additional confirmation or clarification regarding the ritual's true, original requirements, while the days steadily counted down toward an astronomical event that she now understood, with growing dread, carried the very real potential to unleash violence and horror upon BlackWell's unsuspecting residents should the Hargrove family's careful but ultimately imperfect preparations prove insufficient once again. The night of the blood moon finally arrived on a clear, unusually cold autumn evening, the sky gradually darkening from its normal blue toward a deepening, ominous shade of orange and red as the moon began its slow ascent above BlackWell's surrounding cornfields. Mara attended the town's improvised harvest celebration alongside most of BlackWell's residents, maintaining a careful, watchful vigilance even as she participated in the gathering's deliberately casual, festive atmosphere designed to avoid alarming anyone unaware of the tradition's true, darker purpose. She noticed Thomas and Alice Hargrove slip away from the gathering as the appointed hour approached, moving quietly toward their family farm to begin the ritual's demanding preparations, and she felt a fresh surge of anxious tension as she watched their departure, knowing that the coming hours would likely determine whether BlackWell faced a peaceful, uneventful night or a repeat of the horrifying violence documented in her old case files from decades earlier. Sheriff Pruitt remained at the town gathering, maintaining the appearance of normal celebration while quietly coordinating with his deputies to ensure additional patrol coverage throughout the surrounding area as a precautionary measure. Mara excused herself from the festivities as the blood moon climbed higher into the darkening sky, unable to simply wait passively for news while the Hargrove family attempted their crucial, uncertain ritual, and drove instead toward the edge of town nearest the Hargrove property, hoping to remain close enough to respond quickly should anything go wrong during the ceremony now unfolding somewhere among those darkened, moonlit cornfields. Mara parked her patrol vehicle along the quiet road bordering the Hargrove property, watching the distant farmhouse and its surrounding fields bathed in the eerie, reddish glow of the fully risen blood moon. She could see faint movement near the edge of the cornfield closest to the old scarecrow's fixed position, presumably Thomas and Alice beginning the ritual's careful, demanding preparations, though the distance and darkness prevented her from making out any specific details of their actions. She checked her watch repeatedly, counting the minutes as the moon continued its slow climb toward the exact celestial alignment the ritual apparently required, her anxiety mounting steadily with each passing quarter hour. Around midnight, she noticed the distant figures near the cornfield suddenly still, presumably reaching the ceremony's critical final phase, and she held her breath instinctively, watching for any sign of success or failure in the ritual's crucial concluding moments. For several long, tense minutes, nothing appeared to happen beyond the continued, motionless stillness of the distant figures near the field's edge, and Mara allowed herself the smallest flicker of cautious hope that perhaps the ritual might indeed proceed successfully this time, sparing BlackWell from any repeat of the terrible violence her research had uncovered from decades earlier. Then, without warning, a sound reached her across the quiet night air, distant but unmistakable, a sharp, panicked shout followed immediately by a second voice crying out in obvious alarm, and Mara's heart lurched violently as she recognized, with sickening dread, that something had clearly gone terribly wrong during the ritual's critical final moments. Mara sprinted from her patrol vehicle toward the sound of the panicked shouts, radioing for immediate backup as she ran across the uneven, moonlit terrain separating the road from the Hargrove Properties cornfield. She reached the edge of the field just in time to see Ellis Hargrove stumbling backward from his father's motionless form, his face contorted with a horror Mara had never before witnessed on another human being's features. She rushed forward and found Thomas Hargrove collapsed on the ground near the base of the ancient scarecrow, blood pooling rapidly beneath him from a series of deep, savage wounds that looked disturbingly similar to the descriptions in her old case files from decades earlier. Ellis, barely coherent through his obvious shock, managed to explain that the scarecrow had simply come alive during the ceremony's final, critical moment, moving with impossible speed and violence to attack his father before he could complete the ritual's last remaining step. Mara looked up toward the scarecrow itself and felt her blood run cold at what she witnessed. The ancient figure's burlap head tilted at an angle that suggested genuine, conscious awareness rather than the simple, inert stillness of an ordinary agricultural fixture, its previously faded, featureless face now marked by two dark, hollow depressions that seemed to track her own frightened movement with unmistakable, predatory attention. As sirens began wailing in the distance, signaling the approach of the backup she had desperately radioed for, the scarecrow's straw-stuffed arm twitched suddenly, and Mara understood, with a horror that settled deep into the very core of her being, that whatever ancient, dangerous force the town's original settlers had bargained with generations earlier had finally, catastrophically broken free. Mara pulled Ellis backward away from his father's body, understanding immediately that Thomas's wounds were far too severe for any hope of survival, and focused instead on getting Ellis to safety before the awakened scarecrow could turn its attention toward them as well. The creature remained motionless for several agonizing seconds, its hollow, dark eyes tracking their retreat with an unnerving, deliberate patience that suggested confidence rather than any genuine urgency to pursue its next victims immediately. Mara used this brief reprieve to guide Ellis toward her patrol vehicle, practically dragging him across the uneven field as his shock and grief threatened to overwhelm his ability to move under his own power. She had nearly reached the vehicle when she heard a sound behind them that sent fresh terror coursing through her entire body, a dry, rustling movement entirely unlike anything a human or animal should produce, accompanied by a low, creaking groan reminiscent of old, weathered wood bending under sudden strain. She glanced back and saw the scarecrow moving now, its straw-stuffed limbs bending and flexing with an unnatural, jerking rhythm as it began advancing steadily across the cornfield toward their position, its burlap face somehow conveying an expression of predatory hunger despite its lack of any conventional facial features. Mara shoved Ellis into the passenger seat of her patrol vehicle and scrambled into the driver's seat herself, starting the engine with hands that trembled violently from adrenaline and horror, and threw the vehicle into reverse just as the creature reached the edge of the road, its dark, hollow eyes fixed intently upon them as they sped away into the moonlit darkness, leaving Thomas Hargrove's body behind in the field where the ancient, terrible bargain had so catastrophically failed. Mara drove directly toward the arriving backup units, flagging down Sheriff Pruitt's vehicle along the main road and quickly explaining, in urgent, halting sentences, everything that had just occurred at the Hargrove property. Pruitt's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to horrified understanding as Mara described the scarecrow's sudden, violent animation and Thomas Hargrove's brutal death, and he immediately began coordinating additional resources, calling for every available deputy to converge on the area while simultaneously trying to determine how best to warn the broader town population without triggering the kind of widespread panic that might itself lead to additional casualties. Ellis remained largely silent throughout this urgent exchange, still visibly in shock from witnessing his father's violent death, occasionally muttering fragments about needing to find his family's old journal for any additional guidance it might contain regarding how to stop or contain the creature now loose within BlackWell's fields. Mara suggested returning to the Hargrove farmhouse to retrieve the journal, reasoning that whatever fragmentary knowledge it contained might prove crucial in determining how to address the immediate, escalating crisis, though she recognized the significant risk involved in returning anywhere near the property where the awakened creature had last been sighted. Pruitt reluctantly agreed to the plan, assigning 2 additional deputies to accompany Mara and Ellis back toward the farmhouse while he personally oversaw the broader effort to alert and protect the town's remaining residents, all of them acutely aware that every passing minute increased the likelihood that the creature might claim additional victims somewhere within BlackWell's dark, sprawling network of cornfields and quiet, unsuspecting residential streets. Mara and Ellis, accompanied by 2 deputies, approached the Hargrove farmhouse cautiously, weapons drawn despite considerable uncertainty regarding whether conventional firearms would prove effective against a creature whose very nature defied any normal explanation. They found the farmhouse apparently undisturbed, and Ellis led them quickly to the locked family safe where his father had kept the old, water-damaged journal documenting whatever fragmentary knowledge previous generations had recorded regarding the ritual and its associated dangers. As Ellis worked to open the safe with trembling, unsteady hands, Mara positioned herself near the farmhouse's front window, watching the darkened fields beyond for any sign of the creature's approach, her heart pounding with an anxious dread that refused to fully subside despite the temporary safety their current shelter seemed to provide. Ellis finally managed to retrieve the journal and began flipping through its brittle, aging pages with desperate urgency, searching for any passage that might offer practical guidance regarding how to stop or contain the awakened creature now roaming loose somewhere within the surrounding darkness. He found a passage near the journal's final pages that appeared to have been added more recently than the rest of the document, written in a different, more modern hand that Ellis recognized immediately as his own grandfather's careful script, describing in vague, unsettling terms the previous ritual failure decades earlier and the desperate, dangerous methods his grandfather had eventually employed to finally subdue the creature before it could claim additional victims beyond those it had already brutally killed during that terrible autumn many years before Mara or Ellis had even been born. According to the journal's hastily written final passage, Ellis's grandfather had eventually managed to subdue the awakened creature by luring it back toward the exact location of its original animation, the scarecrow's traditional post within the Hargrove cornfield, using fire as both a lure and a weapon to force the creature back into whatever inert, dormant state it normally maintained between blood-moon cycles. The passage warned that this method carried significant risk, requiring careful timing and considerable personal danger to whoever attempted to execute it, and offered no guarantee of success given how imperfectly even Ellis's own grandfather had apparently understood the true mechanism behind the creature's animation and subsequent return to dormancy. Mara studied the passage carefully alongside Ellis, recognizing that this fragmentary, uncertain guidance represented their only concrete lead regarding how to address the immediate crisis, however risky and poorly understood the suggested method actually remained. She radioed this information to Sheriff Pruitt, who agreed reluctantly that attempting to lure the creature back toward its original field using fire represented their best available option given the extreme urgency of the situation and the complete absence of any more reliable, better documented alternative approach. As they finished this urgent planning discussion, a new report crackled through Mara's radio from one of the deputies patrolling the town's outer roads, his voice tight with barely controlled panic as he reported discovering a body near the old grain silo on the town's eastern edge, bearing wounds disturbingly similar to those Mara had witnessed on Thomas Hargrove's own body only a short while earlier, confirming with horrifying certainty that the awakened creature had already claimed its second victim of the night. Mara and the deputies rushed toward the reported location near the old grain silo, arriving to find a scene of horrific violence. The victim, an elderly farmhand named Roy Danvers who had apparently been checking on his equipment despite the town's efforts to encourage residents to remain safely indoors during the harvest celebration, lying savagely torn apart in a manner that left little doubt regarding the creature's continued, relentless hunting throughout the surrounding area. Mara forced herself to examine the scene professionally despite her mounting horror, noting the pattern of the wounds and the direction of apparent movement suggested by disturbed earth and broken corn stalks nearby, information that might prove useful in tracking the creature's subsequent movements through the dark, sprawling fields surrounding BlackWell's residential center. Sheriff Pruitt arrived shortly afterward, his expression grim as he surveyed the gruesome scene, and immediately ordered a comprehensive lockdown of the entire town, directing every available deputy to go door-to-door, warning residents to remain inside with doors and windows securely locked until further notice. Mara relayed the information from Ellis's grandfather's journal regarding the fire-based method for luring the creature back toward its original dormant position, and Pruitt agreed that they needed to attempt this desperate strategy as quickly as possible before the creature could claim any additional victims among BlackWell's now thoroughly alarmed and increasingly panicked population. They began organizing a small team to execute the dangerous plan, gathering fuel and torches while Ellis provided what additional guidance he could recall from his hurried reading of his grandfather's fragmentary, incomplete instructions, all of them acutely aware that they were essentially improvising a desperate response to a threat none of them fully understood based on decades-old, imperfectly recorded knowledge that offered no genuine guarantee of success. As the team prepared their desperate plan to lure the creature back toward the Hargrove cornfield, additional reports began crackling through the radio network, describing sightings of the creature moving with terrifying speed through various sections of town, always accompanied moments later by the discovery of another mutilated victim who had failed to heed the lockdown warnings in time. Mara felt sick with each new report, understanding that every additional death represented a life that might have been saved had they somehow moved more quickly or understood the ritual's true requirements more completely before this catastrophic failure had ever occurred. Sheriff Pruitt coordinated the response as effectively as circumstances allowed, directing available deputies toward the reported sighting locations while simultaneously advancing their own plan to prepare the fire-based trap near the Hargrove property. Ellis worked alongside several volunteer farmhands to gather sufficient fuel and construct a rough perimeter of torches and burning barrels near the original Scarecrow's post, hoping the concentrated firelight might prove sufficient to attract the creature's attention and lure it back toward the location where his grandfather had apparently once successfully forced it back into dormancy decades earlier. Mara helped coordinate this effort while maintaining constant radio contact with the deputies tracking the creature's continued, horrifying rampage through the town's darkened streets, her anxiety mounting with each passing minute as the death toll continued climbing and their carefully improvised trap remained frustratingly incomplete, leaving her to wonder with growing dread whether they would manage to finish their preparations before the creature claimed yet another victim, or whether they might instead find themselves facing it directly, unprepared, before their desperate plan could ever be properly executed. The trap finally reached completion just as a new, more urgent radio report crackled through the network, describing the creature's sudden, unexpected approach toward the very cornfield where Ellis and the volunteer farmhands had been working, apparently drawn by some combination of the gathering firelight and whatever deeper, instinctive connection tied it inexorably back toward its original, ancestral post within the Hargrove family's land. Mara rushed toward the field alongside Sheriff Pruitt, arriving just in time to witness the creature's terrifying approach through the darkened cornstalks, its burlap form now stained heavily with the blood of its earlier victims, moving with a fluid, predatory grace entirely at odds with its ostensibly simple, straw-stuffed construction. Ellis and the farmhands scrambled to complete the fire perimeter's final section as the creature drew steadily closer, its hollow, dark eyes fixed with unnerving intensity upon the assembled group of humans who had dared attempt to lure it back toward captivity. Mara raised her weapon instinctively despite her uncertainty regarding its likely effectiveness, positioning herself near the trap's entrance to help guide the creature toward the intended location should their desperate plan actually begin working as hoped. The creature paused briefly at the field's edge, seeming almost to study the assembled fire and torches with a wary, calculating attention that struck Mara as disturbingly intelligent for what should have been a simple, inanimate agricultural fixture, before finally continuing its slow, deliberate advance directly toward the waiting trap, and Mara found herself holding her breath, praying desperately that Ellis's grandfather's decades-old, incompletely understood method might indeed prove sufficient to finally end this horrifying night's escalating violence before any additional lives were lost. As the creature advanced deeper into the fire perimeter's carefully constructed boundary, Ellis began reciting words from his grandfather's journal, a rough phonetic transcription of what appeared to be some kind of ritual incantation intended to accompany the fire-based containment method, his voice trembling badly but growing steadily more confident as he continued through the brief, unfamiliar passage. The creature's advance slowed noticeably as Ellis spoke, its dark, hollow eyes fixing upon him with an intensity that suggested the words carried genuine, meaningful effect rather than simply representing empty, superstitious ritual. Mara watched with cautious, desperate hope as the creature's movements grew increasingly erratic and hesitant, as though some internal conflict were being waged between whatever violent, predatory instinct currently drove its actions and whatever deeper, more fundamental connection tied it back toward its original, dormant purpose within the Hargrove family's ancestral field. Ellis continued the incantation with growing urgency, his voice rising as he approached what appeared to be the passage's critical final lines, and the creature let out a sound Mara had never before heard from any living or unliving thing, a horrifying combination of rage and pain that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. For a terrifying moment, Mara feared the creature might break free of whatever restraining effect the incantation and surrounding fire perimeter had begun to establish, its straw-stuffed limbs thrashing violently as it seemed to fight against an increasingly powerful, restrictive force. Then, just as Ellis finished the final words of his grandfather's desperate, decades-old ritual, the creature suddenly went completely still, its dark, hollow eyes dimming perceptibly as its violent, animated movement finally, mercifully ceased entirely. The assembled group remained frozen in tense, uncertain silence for several long moments after the creature's sudden stillness, none of them entirely confident that the apparent success of Ellis's desperate ritual represented a genuine, lasting resolution rather than merely a temporary pause in the ongoing violence that had already claimed several lives throughout the preceding hours. Sheriff Pruitt eventually approached the motionless creature cautiously, weapon still raised despite its apparent return to inert, dormant stillness, and confirmed after careful examination that it had indeed returned to something resembling its original, ordinary scarecrow appearance, its burlap face once again faded and featureless, its limbs hanging loosely in the same lifeless manner Mara remembered from her entire childhood spent driving past this same cornfield without ever suspecting the horrifying, violent potential hidden within what she had always assumed was simply an unremarkable piece of agricultural equipment. Ellis collapsed to his knees near the field's edge, overwhelmed by exhaustion, grief, and the sheer psychological weight of everything he had witnessed and somehow managed to accomplish throughout this single, catastrophic night. Mara knelt beside him, offering what comfort she could while Sheriff Pruitt began coordinating the grim, necessary process of accounting for the night's casualties and beginning whatever investigation might eventually be required to explain the violence to the broader public without revealing the true, supernatural nature of what had actually occurred. As dawn's first pale light finally began breaking over the horizon, illuminating the cornfield's now peaceful, motionless scarecrow in ordinary morning sunlight, Mara found herself wondering, with a dread she could not entirely suppress despite their apparent success, whether this terrible night's violence had truly reached its conclusion, or whether some deeper, more fundamental danger still lurked, dormant but far from destroyed, within the ancient, weathered figure standing sentinel once more among BlackWell's quiet, blood-stained fields. In the days following that horrific night, BlackWell struggled to process the scope of the violence that had occurred, 5 confirmed deaths ultimately attributed, through a carefully constructed official narrative, to an unidentified wild animal that had somehow evaded capture despite an extensive search of the surrounding countryside. Sheriff Pruitt worked closely with the small circle of town officials aware of the true, supernatural circumstances to maintain this cover story, understanding that revealing the genuine truth would likely trigger a level of panic and disbelief that would serve no productive purpose for the grieving, traumatized community. Mara attended Thomas Hargrove's funeral alongside most of the town's remaining residents, watching Ellis accept condolences with the same quiet, guarded reserve she had always associated with his character. though she now understood the profound weight of responsibility and grief he carried privately beneath that familiar, controlled exterior. She spent considerable time in the weeks that followed continuing her own research into the town's history and the ritual's true origins, hoping to develop a more complete, reliable understanding that might prevent any future catastrophic failure similar to the two documented incidents now separated by roughly 60 years of relative peace. Ellis, for his part, began the difficult process of assuming full responsibility for his family's ancestral obligations, poring over his grandfather's journal and whatever additional historical records he could locate, determined to ensure that his own eventual stewardship of the ritual proved more reliable and better understood than the imperfect, incomplete knowledge that had contributed to both this most recent catastrophic failure and the earlier one from decades before his own birth. Mara continued assisting Ellis with his research whenever her regular deputy duties allowed, and together they gradually pieced together a more complete, if still imperfect, understanding of the ritual's true historical origins and requirements. They discovered, through careful examination of the town's oldest surviving records, that the original bargain struck by BlackWell's founding settlers had apparently involved some kind of ancient, malevolent presence already dwelling within the land long before the settlers' arrival, a presence the desperate, starving founders had attempted to contain and appease through the creation of the Scarecrow vessel and its associated ritual, rather than fully destroying or banishing entirely, likely, due to limitations in their own understanding or capability at the time of that original, desperate arrangement. This discovery troubled Mara considerably, raising the uncomfortable possibility that the entire tradition represented not a permanent solution to the ancient threat, but merely a temporary, imperfect containment method that would require indefinite, ongoing maintenance across countless future generations to prevent the same catastrophic violence from eventually recurring. She shared this troubling theory with Ellis, who received it with grim, resigned acceptance rather than genuine surprise, admitting that he had begun suspecting something similar himself based on the fragmentary historical patterns he had uncovered during his own independent research. Sheriff Pruitt, when informed of this development, expressed similar concern regarding the long-term implications for BlackWell's continued safety, acknowledging that the town's official emergency protocols and historical record-keeping practices surrounding the tradition clearly required substantial improvement to prevent future generations from facing the same kind of dangerous uncertainty and incomplete knowledge that had so nearly proven catastrophic during this most recent crisis. As autumn gradually gave way to winter, life in BlackWell slowly began returning to something resembling its normal, familiar rhythm, though Mara noticed subtle, lasting changes in the town's collective mood, a heightened wariness surrounding the cornfields that had once seemed entirely unremarkable, and an unspoken but palpable relief whenever conversation turned toward topics unrelated to the terrible violence everyone had collectively agreed, through careful and deliberate silence, not to discuss openly. Ellis assumed increasingly formal responsibility for his family's ancestral farm and its associated traditional obligations, working diligently to establish more thorough, reliable documentation of the ritual's requirements that might prevent future generations from facing the same dangerous uncertainty that had so nearly proven fatal for the entire town. Mara found herself drawn increasingly into this ongoing effort, her professional background in careful, methodical investigation proving genuinely valuable in helping organize and cross-reference the scattered, fragmentary historical records into something resembling a coherent, reliable body of practical knowledge. She and Ellis developed a cautious, respectful working relationship throughout this collaborative effort, bonded by their shared experience of that horrifying night and their mutual determination to ensure BlackWell never again faced such catastrophic, poorly understood danger. Sheriff Pruitt, meanwhile, worked quietly behind the scenes to establish more formal, institutional safeguards within the local government structure, ensuring that future sheriffs and town officials would receive more thorough, deliberate briefing regarding the tradition's true nature and requirements rather than the vague, incomplete understanding he himself had originally received upon assuming his own position decades earlier, a reform he considered essential given how nearly the town's incomplete institutional knowledge had contributed to this most recent, catastrophic failure. Despite these ongoing efforts toward greater preparation and institutional reform, Mara found herself unable to fully shake a persistent, nagging unease regarding the true, complete nature of whatever ancient presence the town's original bargain had attempted to contain within the Hargrove family's ancestral scarecrow. She continued researching independently, eventually locating a small collection of even older documents housed within the County Historical Society's archive, records predating even the town's own official founding that suggested the original native populations who had once inhabited the region had indeed deliberately avoided settling permanently upon this particular stretch of land, consistent with the vague folklore fragments Mara had heard throughout her own childhood but had never previously been able to substantiate through any genuine historical documentation. These older records offered only fragmentary, incomplete descriptions of whatever ancient danger the original inhabitants had apparently recognized and avoided, though several passages suggested a presence considerably older and more powerful than anything the town's own settlers had likely fully comprehended when they made their own desperate, ultimately imperfect bargain generations later. Mara shared these troubling discoveries with Ellis, who received the information with the same grim, resigned acceptance he had displayed throughout their entire ongoing collaborative research effort, acknowledging that the true scope and nature of whatever ancient force lay dormant beneath BlackWell's fertile, productive fields likely exceeded anything either of them could reasonably hope to fully understand or permanently resolve through their own limited, contemporary efforts. This sobering realization left both of them with a shared, unspoken understanding that their current efforts, however diligent and well-intentioned, likely represented only another temporary, imperfect chapter in an ongoing, generational struggle to contain a danger that might never truly be eliminated entirely from the ancient, blood-stained land surrounding their quiet, unsuspecting town. As winter deepened and the anniversary of that terrible autumn night gradually receded further into BlackWell's collective, carefully maintained silence, Mara noticed occasional small, unsettling signs that suggested the ancient presence contained within the Hargrove scarecrow might not be resting quite as peacefully as everyone desperately hoped. Livestock throughout the surrounding farms occasionally exhibited unexplained agitation during otherwise ordinary nights, particularly whenever the moon happened to rise especially bright and full above the horizon, and several residents living nearest the Hargrove property reported vague, unsettling dreams featuring imagery disturbingly similar to descriptions Mara had gathered from the handful of surviving witnesses to the recent violence. Ellis took these reports seriously, increasing his own already vigilant maintenance schedule regarding the scarecrow's physical condition and the surrounding field's careful, ritual upkeep, though he admitted to Mara during one of their now regular research sessions that he possessed no genuine confidence regarding whether such increased vigilance would prove sufficient to prevent any future, unexpected complications given how imperfectly even his own family's generations of careful stewardship had ultimately managed to understand or control the ancient force they had inherited responsibility for containing. Mara found herself increasingly committed to this ongoing effort, her original, purely professional interest in solving old case files having evolved gradually into something resembling genuine, personal investment in protecting the town she had once been so eager to leave behind entirely. She began spending considerable personal time at the Hargrove farm beyond her official deputy duties, helping Ellis maintain careful, detailed records and periodic monitoring of the field's condition, both of them united by a shared, unspoken understanding that their collective vigilance represented BlackWell's only meaningful defense against whatever ancient, patient danger continued lurking dormant beneath the town's deceptively peaceful, productive cornfields. Nearly a year after that catastrophic autumn night, as the next blood moon's distant, approaching date once again appeared within the pages of the local almanac, Mara found herself experiencing a profound, anxious sense of déjà vu that she struggled to fully suppress despite the considerable preparation and improved institutional knowledge she and Ellis had worked so diligently to establish throughout the preceding months. Sheriff Pruitt, now fully briefed regarding every relevant detail Mara and Ellis had managed to uncover through their extensive collaborative research, began coordinating more comprehensive precautionary measures well in advance of the approaching celestial event, determined to avoid any repeat of the previous crisis's improvised, last-minute scrambling. Ellis, having spent the entire intervening year studying and refining his understanding of his family's ancestral responsibilities, expressed cautious confidence that this time's ritual renewal would proceed successfully, provided no unexpected complications arose to disrupt the ceremony's careful, precisely timed requirements. Mara wanted desperately to share his cautious optimism, though her own extensive research into the tradition's deeper, more ancient origins left her with a persistent, nagging awareness that they still understood only a fraction of whatever true, ancient danger their careful, generational stewardship actually contained. As the approaching blood moon's date drew steadily closer, she found herself once again reviewing every available piece of historical documentation, searching desperately for any additional insight that might further improve their chances of avoiding a repeat of the previous year's catastrophic violence, while simultaneously preparing herself, with grim, practical determination, for whatever role she might need to play should their careful preparations once again prove tragically, catastrophically insufficient. 2 weeks before the approaching blood moon, Mara received an unexpected visit from Edith Calloway, whose careful, deliberate expression immediately suggested she carried news of some significance regarding the town's ongoing preparations. Edith explained that she had recently discovered, tucked within a box of her late mother's old personal effects, a small collection of additional historical documents that appeared to predate even the records Mara and Ellis had already carefully catalogued throughout their extensive research efforts. These newly discovered documents, written in faded, difficult-to-decipher handwriting, suggested that the original ritual, as first established by BlackWell's founding settlers, had actually required a more extensive, communal participation than even Edith's own earlier recollections had previously indicated, involving specific contributions from multiple founding families rather than the increasingly isolated, singular responsibility the Hargrove family had gradually assumed over subsequent generations. Mara felt a fresh surge of anxious urgency at this revelation, understanding that if Edith's newly discovered documents proved accurate, their current preparations, despite considerable improvement over the previous year's catastrophic scrambling, might still fall critically short of the ritual's true, original requirements. She rushed the new documents immediately to Ellis, who studied them with growing alarm alongside his own extensive collection of family records, eventually confirming that certain details within Edith's newly discovered materials did indeed align with fragmentary references he had previously dismissed as unclear or contradictory within his own grandfather's incomplete journal. With the blood moon now only 2 weeks away, Mara and Ellis found themselves facing an urgent, difficult scramble to identify and coordinate with descendants of BlackWell's other original founding families, hoping desperately that sufficient time remained to properly incorporate whatever additional communal participation the ritual's true, ancient requirements actually demanded. Working against the rapidly diminishing time remaining before the blood moon's arrival, Mara and Ellis, with considerable assistance from Sheriff Pruitt's official resources and connections, managed to identify several families throughout BlackWell whose ancestry traced back to the town's original founding settlers, families who, according to Edith's newly discovered documents, should theoretically share some portion of the ritual's traditional, communal responsibility alongside the Hargrove family's own long-standing stewardship. Approaching these families proved considerably more difficult than simply identifying them, since most had long since lost any conscious awareness of their own ancestral connection to the town's dangerous, secretive tradition, and several reacted with understandable skepticism or outright disbelief when Mara and Ellis attempted to explain the urgent, dangerous situation now rapidly approaching alongside the coming blood moon. Sheriff Pruitt's official authority and reputation ultimately proved essential in eventually convincing at least a handful of these skeptical families to participate, even if their understanding of the situation remained incomplete given the extremely limited time available for proper explanation and preparation. Mara found herself working nearly around the clock throughout those final 2 weeks, coordinating logistics, gathering necessary materials, and helping Ellis refine the ritual's expanded, more communally involved requirements based on Edith's newly discovered documentation, all while maintaining her regular deputy responsibilities and managing her own mounting, persistent anxiety regarding whether their hurried, last-minute adjustments would genuinely prove sufficient to prevent a repeat of the previous year's catastrophic violence, or whether they were simply improvising yet another imperfect, incomplete response to a danger that continued to prove far more complex and demanding than anyone currently involved in its ongoing containment truly understood. As the blood moon's arrival finally approached, Mara found herself once again standing at the edge of the Hargrove cornfield on a clear, cold autumn evening, though this time accompanied by a considerably larger gathering of participants than the isolated, private ceremony Thomas Hargrove had attempted alone the previous year. Representatives from each identified founding family had gathered at Ellis's careful direction, each assigned specific roles and responsibilities based on the fragmentary but increasingly detailed understanding Mara and Ellis had managed to piece together from Edith's newly discovered historical documents. Sheriff Pruitt maintained a discreet but substantial security presence throughout the surrounding area, having learned from the previous year's chaotic, reactive response to ensure comprehensive precautionary measures were firmly in place well before any potential crisis could develop. Mara watched the elaborate, expanded ceremony unfold with a complicated mixture of cautious hope and persistent, underlying anxiety, understanding that despite their considerably improved preparation compared to the previous year's catastrophic failure, they were still fundamentally attempting to properly execute a ritual whose true, complete requirements remained only partially understood even after months of dedicated, collaborative research. As the blood moon climbed steadily higher into the darkening sky above, casting its familiar, ominous reddish glow across the assembled participants and the ancient, waiting scarecrow standing sentinel at the field center, Mara found herself holding her breath once again, praying fervently that this year's more thorough, communally supported effort would finally prove sufficient to properly contain whatever ancient, dangerous presence continued lurking dormant within BlackWell's fertile, blood-stained fields. The expanded ceremony proceeded with careful, deliberate precision as the blood moon reached its highest point in the night sky, each participating family completing their assigned role in sequence according to Ellis's carefully coordinated instructions, derived from the combined historical knowledge he and Mara had managed to assemble from every available fragmentary source throughout their months of dedicated research. Mara watched with cautious, mounting hope as the ceremony progressed smoothly through each successive stage, apparently avoiding whatever critical gap or oversight had contributed to the previous year's catastrophic failure during Thomas Hargrove's isolated, incomplete attempt at the ritual's proper execution. As the ceremony approached its final, critical concluding phase, Ellis stepped forward to complete the ritual's traditional, Hargrove-specific responsibility, reciting the same incantation from his grandfather's journal that had ultimately proven successful in returning the awakened creature to dormancy during the previous year's desperate, improvised confrontation. This time, however, he spoke the words not in desperate crisis response, but as part of a properly timed, comprehensive ceremony explicitly designed to prevent the creature's dangerous animation from ever occurring in the first place. Mara held her breath as Ellis finished the incantation's final words, watching the ancient scarecrow closely for any sign of the terrifying transformation she had witnessed firsthand during the previous year's catastrophic night, and felt a profound, overwhelming wave of relief wash over her as the figure remained peacefully, reassuringly motionless throughout the ceremony's conclusion, its faded, featureless burlap face betraying no hint of the violent, predatory consciousness that had briefly animated it during that terrible autumn night exactly 1 year earlier. As the blood moon gradually began its slow descent back toward the horizon, the assembled participants remained cautiously vigilant for several additional hours, unwilling to fully celebrate their apparent success until sufficient time had passed to confirm with genuine confidence that the ritual had indeed proceeded successfully this time without any of the catastrophic complications that had plagued the previous year's isolated, incomplete attempt. Sheriff Pruitt maintained his careful security presence throughout this extended waiting period, and gradually, as the night progressed without any further sign of danger or unusual activity, a tentative, hopeful sense of relief began spreading among the assembled group of founding family representatives who had gathered together for this historic, expanded ceremony. Mara found herself experiencing a complicated mixture of profound relief and lingering, persistent unease, recognizing that while this particular blood moon cycle appeared to have concluded successfully, the fundamental, ancient danger contained within the Hargrove family's ancestral scarecrow remained far from permanently eliminated, requiring continued, indefinite vigilance and careful ritual maintenance across whatever future generations might eventually inherit responsibility for. BlackWell's ongoing, delicate containment efforts. Ellis approached her as dawn's first pale light finally began breaking over the horizon, his expression carrying a complicated blend of profound relief and the same persistent, underlying weariness Mara had come to recognize as an inevitable companion to the heavy, generational responsibility his family had carried for so many decades. He thanked her quietly for everything she had contributed throughout their extensive collaborative research and preparation efforts, acknowledging that her outside perspective and professional investigative skills had likely proven essential in helping identify and address gaps in his own family's imperfect, incomplete historical understanding of the tradition's true requirements. In the weeks following this successful, expanded ceremony, BlackWell gradually settled back into its familiar, ordinary rhythms, though Mara noticed a subtle but meaningful shift in the town's broader collective awareness regarding the tradition's true nature and importance. The participating founding families, having witnessed firsthand the genuine, serious stakes involved in properly maintaining their ancestral obligations, began establishing more formal, ongoing arrangements to ensure future generations would receive clearer, more comprehensive education regarding their shared responsibility, rather than allowing the crucial knowledge to remain isolated within a single family's increasingly private, insular stewardship as had apparently occurred gradually over the many decades separating the two documented ritual failures. Sheriff Pruitt worked alongside town officials to establish more formal institutional protocols ensuring that future law enforcement leadership would receive thorough, deliberate briefing regarding the tradition, hoping to prevent any future sheriff from facing the same dangerous uncertainty and incomplete understanding that had complicated the initial response to the previous year's catastrophic crisis. Mara found herself unofficially but genuinely embraced as an ongoing, valued participant in these broader efforts, her methodical investigative skills and outside perspective having proven sufficiently valuable that both Ellis and the town's other participating families actively sought her continued involvement in maintaining and refining their collective, ongoing preparation for future blood moon cycles. She accepted this expanded, unofficial role with a complicated mixture of genuine satisfaction at having found meaningful purpose within the town she had once been so eager to leave behind, and persistent, underlying awareness that this newfound purpose was permanently intertwined with an ancient, dangerous secret that would likely continue demanding her vigilant attention for the remainder of her life. As months passed and BlackWell's collective memory of the previous year's violence gradually softened, though never fully faded, into the same kind of carefully maintained, deliberate silence that had apparently characterized the town's response to the earlier documented incident from decades before, Mara found herself increasingly drawn into a deeper, more personal understanding of the ancient presence her community had spent generations attempting to contain. She continued her collaborative research with Ellis, gradually piecing together additional fragments of the older, pre-settlement historical records housed within the county archive, hoping to eventually develop a more complete understanding of whatever ancient force truly lurked beneath BlackWell's fertile, productive fields. This ongoing research yielded troubling, if still incomplete, suggestions that the presence contained within the Hargrove scarecrow represented merely a single, localized manifestation of some far larger, more ancient danger that might extend well beyond BlackWell's own modest boundaries, potentially connected to similarly unexplained historical incidents documented in several neighboring communities throughout the broader region. Mara found this expanding scope of potential danger deeply unsettling, recognizing that even their considerably improved, more communally supported containment efforts might ultimately represent only a small, localized response to a threat whose true scope and nature likely exceeded anything BlackWell's own limited historical knowledge and resources could ever hope to fully address or understand. She shared these troubling suspicions with Ellis and Sheriff Pruitt, both of whom received the unsettling implications with the same grim, resigned acceptance that had characterized their entire collaborative effort throughout the preceding year, acknowledging that some mysteries and dangers might simply exceed their own limited, contemporary capacity to fully resolve, regardless of how diligently and thoroughly they continued their ongoing, dedicated research. Nearly 2 years after that first catastrophic night, Mara received a call from a colleague in a neighboring county sheriff department, a woman she had befriended during a regional law enforcement training seminar, mentioning in passing an unusual, unsolved case involving several unexplained deaths that had occurred in her own jurisdiction under circumstances bearing an unsettling resemblance to details Mara had once shared, in carefully vague and general terms, regarding her own department's experience with unexplained rural violence. Mara felt a fresh chill of alarm at this seemingly casual mention, recognizing potential confirmation of her own troubling suspicions regarding the broader, regional scope of whatever ancient danger BlackWell's own tradition had been established to contain. She began cautiously investigating this new lead, coordinating carefully with her colleague to gather additional details regarding the neighboring county's unexplained deaths, and discovered troubling similarities in both the nature of the victim's wounds and the timing of the incidents relative to another documented celestial event, suggesting the strong possibility that a similar, related tradition and danger might exist within that neighboring community as well, likely maintained through its own separate, isolated lineage of secretive, generational stewardship, entirely unaware of BlackWell's own parallel experience and hard-won knowledge. Mara shared this significant discovery with Ellis and Sheriff Pruitt, and together they began cautiously discussing whether reaching out to establish some form of careful, discreet communication with whatever similar tradition might exist within that neighboring county could prove mutually beneficial, potentially allowing both communities to share crucial knowledge and improve their respective containment efforts, though all three of them recognized the significant challenges and risks inherent in approaching such a sensitive, dangerous topic with an entirely unfamiliar community that might prove just as guarded and secretive regarding their own ancient, inherited obligations as BlackWell's own founding families had historically remained. As Mara continued cautiously investigating this potential connection to the neighboring county's own unexplained violence, she found herself growing increasingly convinced that BlackWell's ancient danger represented merely one localized manifestation within a far broader, more extensive pattern of similar, ancient presences scattered throughout the wider region, each apparently contained through its own separate, isolated tradition of generational stewardship passed down through different founding families entirely unaware of one another's parallel experience. This growing realization left her with a profound, unsettling sense that the true scope of whatever ancient danger her community had spent generations attempting to understand and contain likely exceeded anything she, Ellis, or Sheriff Pruitt could reasonably hope to fully comprehend through their own limited, localized research efforts. She began cautiously reaching out to additional contacts throughout the broader region, carefully testing whether any other law enforcement officials or local historians might possess similar fragmentary knowledge regarding comparable traditions or unexplained historical violence within their own respective communities. These careful, discreet inquiries yielded several additional promising leads, suggesting the existence of at least 3 or 4 other communities throughout the wider region that might maintain their own separate, isolated versions of a similar containment tradition, though establishing genuine, productive contact with any of these other communities proved considerably more difficult and delicate than Mara had initially anticipated, given the deeply ingrained secrecy and caution that seemed to characterize every such tradition she had thus far managed to identify. As her investigation continued expanding in scope and complexity, Mara found herself facing an increasingly urgent question regarding whether BlackWell's own hard-won knowledge and experience might prove valuable in helping establish some broader, more coordinated regional effort to better understand and address whatever ancient, widespread danger continued lurking dormant beneath the region's peaceful, productive agricultural landscape. Sheriff Pruitt, upon learning the full scope of Mara's expanding regional investigation, expressed both genuine interest in the potential benefits of broader coordination and considerable practical concern regarding how to approach such a sensitive, delicate undertaking without inadvertently exposing BlackWell's own carefully guarded secret to unnecessary additional risk or unwanted outside attention. Ellis, for his part, remained cautiously supportive of Mara's ongoing efforts, though he emphasized repeatedly the importance of prioritizing BlackWell's own immediate, practical containment needs over what he considered a potentially valuable but ultimately secondary goal of establishing broader regional cooperation and knowledge sharing. Mara understood and respected these legitimate concerns, recognizing that her own growing fascination with the broader, regional scope of the ancient danger risked distracting from the more immediate, practical work still required to properly maintain and refine BlackWell's own ongoing containment tradition. She resolved to continue her broader regional research more cautiously and gradually, treating it as a long-term, secondary project that would not interfere with her primary, ongoing commitment to supporting Ellis and the town's expanded network of founding families in their continued preparation for future blood moon cycles. As the third blood moon since the original catastrophic incident approached on the horizon, now with considerably more time available for careful, deliberate preparation than either of the two previous cycles had allowed, Mara found herself cautiously optimistic that BlackWell's improved, communally supported tradition would continue proceeding successfully, even as her own growing awareness of the danger's broader regional scope left her with a persistent, nagging sense that the true, complete resolution of this ancient threat likely remained far beyond anything she or her community could reasonably hope to achieve within her own limited, singular lifetime of dedicated effort and careful, ongoing vigilance. The third ceremony proceeded smoothly, benefiting from the considerable additional preparation time and the now well-established, formalized involvement of BlackWell's expanded network of participating founding families, each having developed increasingly confident familiarity with their respective roles and responsibilities throughout the two previous successful cycles. Mara attended once again, though her role had evolved considerably from her original position as a curious, investigating outsider into something resembling a genuine, trusted member of the town's now formally organized stewardship community, a development that would have seemed entirely unimaginable to her during those first anxious, uncertain days following her initial return to BlackWell several years earlier. As the blood moon reached its peak and Ellis completed the ceremony's traditional, concluding incantation, the ancient scarecrow remained peacefully, reassuringly motionless throughout, confirming once again that their collective, careful preparation had successfully prevented any repeat of the catastrophic violence that had once threatened to consume the entire town during that first terrible autumn night. In the aftermath of this third successful ceremony, Mara found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her own life had become intertwined with BlackWell's ancient, dangerous secret, recognizing that she had transformed, almost without conscious intention, from a reluctant returning resident into an essential, dedicated guardian of her hometown's most closely guarded and dangerous tradition. She continued her broader regional research alongside this ongoing local commitment, gradually building a small but growing network of similarly informed contacts throughout the wider area, each cautiously sharing fragments of knowledge regarding their own respective communities' parallel traditions, though the true, complete scope of whatever ancient, widespread danger connected all these scattered, isolated containment efforts remained frustratingly, persistently beyond her ability to fully map or comprehend. Late one autumn evening, nearly 3 years after that first catastrophic night, Mara received an unexpected message from one of her carefully cultivated regional contacts, a local historian from a town roughly 80 miles from BlackWell, describing a discovery that immediately sent a fresh chill of alarm coursing through her entire body. The historian had located, within her own community's oldest surviving records, a map dating back well over a century, apparently created by early regional surveyors, that depicted several specific locations throughout the wider area marked with unusual, unexplained symbols that closely resembled certain protective markings Mara had previously discovered within BlackWell's own oldest historical documents. More troublingly, the map appeared to suggest some kind of deliberate, coordinated pattern connecting these various marked locations, hinting at the possibility that the ancient danger contained within BlackWell's own scarecrow tradition might represent not an isolated, localized phenomenon, but rather a single node within some far larger, more deliberately organized network of similar containment sites, potentially established by some earlier, now largely forgotten civilization or organization, whose true purpose and full understanding of the underlying danger likely exceeded anything the individual founding families of towns like BlackWell had ever managed to independently comprehend on their own. Mara stared at the digital scan of this historical map for a long time that evening, feeling the comfortable, hard-won sense of resolution she had gradually developed regarding BlackWell's own particular danger suddenly feel considerably less secure and complete than she had previously allowed herself to believe, understanding that this new discovery opened up an entirely new, far more expansive set of unsettling questions that she now felt compelled to pursue further, regardless of whatever additional dangers or complications such continued investigation might eventually reveal. Mara shared this significant new discovery with Ellis and Sheriff Pruitt, both of whom reacted with the same complicated mixture of concern and grim, resigned acceptance that had characterized their response to every previous troubling revelation throughout Mara's ongoing regional research. Ellis, though still primarily focused on his immediate, practical responsibility for BlackWell's own local tradition, acknowledged that understanding the broader, historical context behind their family's inherited obligation might eventually prove valuable in developing more effective, comprehensive containment strategies moving forward. Sheriff Pruitt expressed particular concern regarding the practical challenges of investigating such an expansive, historically ancient network without inadvertently drawing unwanted attention from outside authorities or organizations who might respond to such a discovery with considerably less careful, measured caution than BlackWell's own community had gradually developed through hard-won, personal experience. Mara agreed to proceed cautiously with her continued investigation, prioritizing discretion and careful verification over any hasty attempt to fully map or understand the broader network's true extent and purpose. She began corresponding more extensively with her regional historian contact, gradually piecing together additional fragments of historical documentation from several other communities throughout the wider area, each contributing small pieces to an increasingly complex, unsettling puzzle whose complete picture remained frustratingly incomplete despite months of careful, dedicated research. As winter descended once again upon BlackWell's quiet, snow-covered fields, Mara found herself facing an uncertain future filled with expanding questions and unresolved mysteries, understanding that whatever ancient, widespread danger her hometown's own scarecrow tradition represented was likely only a single, small piece within some far larger, more complex historical puzzle that she had only just begun to genuinely comprehend. As the 4th anniversary of that original catastrophic night approached, Mara found herself once again preparing for the upcoming Blood Moon ceremony alongside Ellis, Sheriff Pruitt, and BlackWell's now well-established network of participating founding families, their preparation proceeding with the confident, practiced efficiency that had developed through 3 consecutive successful cycles. Yet even amid this hard-won, comfortable routine, Mara carried with her a persistent, growing awareness that BlackWell's own particular danger represented merely one small, localized manifestation within some far larger, more ancient, and more widespread threat whose true scope and nature she had only begun to genuinely understand through her ongoing, expanding regional research. She continued corresponding with her growing network of contacts throughout the wider area, gradually assembling an increasingly detailed but still frustratingly incomplete picture of the ancient network's likely extent, while simultaneously maintaining her primary, dedicated commitment to ensuring BlackWell's own tradition continued proceeding safely and successfully with each passing cycle. On the night of the 4th ceremony, as the blood moon once again cast its familiar, ominous reddish glow across the Hargrove family's ancestral cornfield, Mara found herself reflecting on how profoundly her life had transformed since that first, seemingly ordinary evening when she had noticed her grandmother's old habit of circling certain dates on the kitchen calendar, understanding now with hard-won, personal clarity exactly what dangerous, ancient significance those carefully circled dates had always actually represented. As the ceremony concluded successfully once again, the ancient scarecrow remaining peacefully dormant throughout, Mara allowed herself a small measure of genuine satisfaction and relief, even as she recognized that this particular, hard-won victory represented only one small chapter within a far larger, ongoing story whose true, complete resolution likely remained many years, and perhaps many additional dangerous discoveries, still ahead of her. In the months following this 4th successful ceremony, Mara received a final, unexpected piece of correspondence from her regional historian contact, describing a newly uncovered reference within an old, obscure academic journal suggesting that the ancient network of containment sites throughout the region might trace back to some organized, coordinated effort considerably older and more deliberate than anyone had previously suspected, potentially connected to events and circumstances that predated even the earliest native settlements Mara had previously researched within BlackWell's own local historical records. This tantalizing but frustratingly incomplete new lead left Mara with far more questions than answers, understanding that whatever true, complete history lay behind BlackWell's own ancient scarecrow tradition likely extended back through a far longer, more complex chain of events than she or anyone else in her small, dedicated circle of researchers had ever previously imagined possible. She found herself standing once more at the edge of the Hargrove cornfield on a quiet, ordinary evening, watching the ancient scarecrow's familiar, motionless silhouette against the darkening autumn sky, and felt a complicated mixture of hard-won pride regarding everything she and her small community had managed to accomplish together, alongside a persistent, unshakable awareness that the true, complete story behind BlackWell's dangerous, ancient inheritance remained far from fully understood or resolved. Somewhere beyond the borders of her own small, familiar town, an entire network of similar dangers likely continued lurking, dormant but far from destroyed, within countless other unsuspecting communities scattered throughout the wider region, waiting patiently, as ancient things so often do, for whatever future moment might finally bring their own long-buried, dangerous secrets back into violent, undeniable life. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'll see you in the next one.